wanna count us in, Hadi?
Oh yeah, sorry. 5, 4.
Welcome to another episode of Talking Kotlin. My name is still Sebastian. I'm one of your hosts here at Talking Kotlin. If you're joining us on YouTube, you can see me wave right now. If you're consuming Talking Kotlin anywhere where it's available in audio form, hello to you too. And I am joined, as usual, by my wonderful co-host, Hadi. How are you, Hadi?
I'm good, and I'm still called Hadi.
Yeah. Isn't that great?
Sorry, that was the best joke I could come up with. I mean, Jesus, man.
It's fine.
Never
Just
mind.
just stick with the weather, maybe. I don't know. Give us the weather report.
I hate the weather. I'm sick of the weather here in Malaga, Spain. It's just disgusting. Like I was saying the other day, I'm like, if I wanted rain, I would have moved to Amsterdam, not this place. But hopefully it'll cheer up a little bit and we'll get some summer soon. But anyway, enough about you. Let's talk about me. No, let's talk about our guests. We have two people today from Realm.
I'm Claus Rørbech and from Denmark, Copenhagen, and joined Realm 1 year ago. So doing Android Kotlin development.
And I'm Nabil. I'm from London. I used to work on Realm pre the acquisition, like 6-7 years ago. And I work also with Claus on the new Kotlin SDKs, previously on the Android Java SDK.
It's really awesome to have you folks on the show. I wanted to tell you folks a little story because back in the day when I was still in university, there was this course about mobile applications development. And it was like super prestigious, and people said like, oh, it's hard to get in, and they ask you to build like a small demo application beforehand. And I did what any sane person would do, which is lock myself into a room for 2 weeks and learn like mobile app development from scratch, having never done it before. And at the point where I wanted to do a bunch of persistence, I got really worried, and I was like, there's so many new concepts to learn. And I found Realm like my savior. And this was like, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years ago. I'm really happy that this circle has kind of closed again, and that I get to talk to folks who work on this great product. So I assume that since I last touched it 5 years ago, some things may have changed a little bit. Do you want to maybe give us a small overview of where Realm currently stands, and maybe also give people a bit of an introduction what it actually is?
So I'll start with like a small pitch for people who are not familiar with Realm. It is a mobile database originally designed for mobile from ground up. What I mean by this is like the storage engine that we'll use is not SQLite or another relational database engine. It is an object database engine. So which gives it a set of interesting characteristics. So the database is written in C++, but we have a set of what we call SDKs or bindings that are available for iOS, Cocoa, Android, and then as well as .NET with Xamarin, JavaScript. We support React Native and Node.js. And recently we added Unity and Flutter. So this is the part what we call the local database. It is free and open source, but as a company pre-acquisition, we used to monetize by monetizing this synchronization aspect of the database, which allows you as a customer to sync the local database into a server, and then you have like automatic conflict resolution and set of other enterprise features. And then we got acquired by Mongo in spring 2019. And then we're still working under Mongo on the database, on the local and the sync. So that's the small history of Realm.
You said pre-acquisition, your model was to do the sync. You don't do that anymore?
We do, but we used to build the entire server cloud infrastructure, and now we integrated part of MongoDB Atlas, which is the hosted version of Mongo on the cloud. So when you sync the database, it goes through a middleware that translates the instruction coming from the sync protocol on the client and then emits them as changes to the document stored in Atlas, basically. And also we revamped some of the user authentication and authorization around the users to integrate more with the whole holistic MongoDB product.
Let's maybe imagine that we're just like an average Android developer, and maybe we've heard about other database solutions. We know about Room. We know about like SQLite. Can you contrast Realm with these implementations?
Sure. So, like I mentioned, we are an object database. So, the first thing you notice when using Realm, if you have previously used other solution, is like the way you define your model. There isn't this what we call object impedance mismatch between the way you write your class as an object-oriented language, like a class person have a name and age, and then the next step you try to match those property into a tabular database, a column, and with relations, etc. With Realm, we take your object, depending on the SDK, you annotate this object or you mark it with a marker interface, and then we generate boilerplate code to talk to the runtime API, which is the Realm. So you don't have to do an extra step to define a schema, for instance, or to do matching between relationships. You have this natural idiomatic way of defining your model. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is like from the early stage when the storage engine was designed, it was behaving as a reactive database. In a sense, it gives you, when you do a query on a certain type, for instance, with filters and predicates, you can register a listener to give you not just a notification when this query have changed because somebody wrote to the database, but it also gives you the fine-grained notification of what changed. And this is particularly interesting in context of UI in mobile, so you can do this animation between the cells more smoothly. So you don't have to pull in another dependency or framework to do this translation between I'm trying to observe what the database is doing or what is the single source of truth, who is modifying the data. You can just use Realm, you register a query on certain type, and then you get notification. So this was like a huge difference. And this was even before Google came up with live data. That was designed from the beginning. The other technical property interesting in the context of mobile as well is what we call lazy loading and zero copy. So usually when you use SQLite or basically any ORM in Android is built on top of SQLite, the database copy the data from the storage engine, which is SQLite, to your data access object, DAO or DTO or whatever architecture you're using. So in Realm, actually, we have proxy object that use native C++ pointer to get you to read the data directly from the memory. So you don't copy the entire object graph and then give it back to the user. So that's the zero copy aspect, and especially when you're in the context of mobile, like especially in early days of Android, like memory constraints were very, very high. So the amount of memory you have per app is very low. So you cannot afford to copy too much object. And also it does, since we're using native memory, not the Java heap memory, we're putting less pressure into the garbage collector. So you don't have this, before there was the GC in Android was like stop the world. So you have less GC poses and you have less pressure on the GC.
So I have a question going back a minute, because when I hear what you're saying about how it works, obviously this is very focused on mobile, right? Because if you're doing any kind of other development, such as server-side or even desktop to an extent, you don't really want to be representing each screen with an object, right? You end up having, even some people would go to the extent of separating their reads from their writes and having different queries there, right? But you said that you used to sell this Realm Sync, which would allow you to sync the local database with a remote one. How difficult has it been to switch that to use MongoDB? I mean, given that MongoDB is a document database and you're talking about objects, I'm assuming that it's not that difficult, but was it a lot of work?
It's an interesting question. It was a lot of work just to implement sync, because it's a hard computer science problem in general to do sync correctly. So we spent at least 2 years roughly working on it to come up with an algorithm that gives you the automatic conflict resolution and is efficient, etc. And then the next phase were how we integrate this with a document database, which is not an object database, because document is a subset of an object database. So what we end up doing is building a translation layer. It takes the op log or the change log of the operation you do locally on your mobile, like you want to insert a new field or modify a field or delete. We take this op log and then translate into a change set that is meaningful to a document database. So that was the part that we were working on right after the acquisition. So now it is available for general public product. So, and it works actually in 2 ways. You can also translate from a document database into an object database. And for instance, we had to come up with new types. For instance, Mongo have this embedded document, so you can do like some links or store a whole document in a more efficient way because of locality of the data. So now we have this embedded object as well in the object database, which is the client.
So let's maybe do our show's name true and dive a little bit deeper into the connection between Kotlin and Realm. So Claus, as I understand it, you folks now have something new, and that's called Realm Kotlin. Can you tell a little bit more about this?
Yeah, so as you say, Realm Java is old or has been there for a number of years, and the whole Android sort of architecture and environment has been going over a lot of phases. And so right now we are trying to ramp up or try to respin a version of the SDK where we sort of focus on the latest and greatest architectural changes in development cycle for mobile. Like we have transitioned into all these unidirectional data flows and all this, which has been with Realm and its live object has been a bit hard to maintain and keep up with where the Android development framework is going. So yeah, it's a great new opportunity to try and do another round or do it in a slightly different way than first time.
Yeah, so just to do like why we're trying to come up with this new SDK is like we did like retrospective of what did work well and not, and we found that the memory model we use at the time for concurrency is based on thread confinement, which should sound similar for Kotlin native. It's like it's either shared or mutable. Because we had some constraint on the C++ level for like some of the data structure were not thread safe, so we had to reflect this in the binding by choosing a thread confinement model, which translates in the usage of the API that you cannot copy some of the object or the realm itself between threads. And then there is this wave of reactive framework that have caught up like 2-3 years ago with RxJava and then Flow and Kotlin. And then people started using those more often in their apps, and then they're trying to move the result of the queries of the realm between threads or coroutine context. And this sometimes created friction because people don't understand sometimes why we're doing this memory model constraint. So we thought, how can we fix this and then keep the other interesting property of Realm, like lazy loading and zero copy, etc., encryption. And then it was difficult to integrate this into the existing Realm Java SDK because it was, one, an API breaking change and also an architectural behavior change. It's a massive change when you move from this the existing model to the new one, where we want to some kind of freeze the element you interact with, similar to what Kotlin Native is doing, so you can pass them between threads. That was the first thing that triggered us to think about writing it from scratch. And then the other thing is, like, we wanted also to support Java desktop with JVM. So we thought multi-platform is maturing enough, so why not rebuild the library around multi-platform to write it as a multi-platform library? That was the main idea behind this new framework.
So at this point, what platforms do you support with this Kotlin multi-platform implementation of Realm?
So far, so the new, so there's two things. There's the Java SDK, which has a thin layer of Kotlin compatibility that is designed in production today only for Android, right? The new SDK we're working on, started last September, is targeting now KMM, so that's iOS. We'll support also macOS and Android, and also JVM desktop. JavaScript is not included because the storage engine itself use some system calls that are not easily translatable into JavaScript world. And we first need to compile the storage engine into WebAssembly and then try to think about how we can integrate it as a JavaScript target. And we also have like existing JavaScript binding doing great work. So we thought we should focus on the KMM use case because that's where the segment of most of the developers are, and then try to expand to JVM, and then maybe in future consider JS as well.
Right, but why JVM? I mean, given what I hear so far, this is kind of heavily focused on mobile, right? Why would you want to expand to JVM?
That's a good question. Actually, the first client we had were Zynga, if you remember them from the days, gaming company. We're powering their platform, server-side platform with Realm. So the first client we had actually were used on the server side. But we were optimized for mobile just for, because we were developing the startup around the era of when the iPhone launched, and there is more opportunity to go into the mobile space than targeting like the backend and server side. Although the database works fine on the server side, but it has some optimization like we do in bit packing to reduce the size of the data that takes in mobile, etc. So all these optimization are cool, but they are heavily optimized for mobile. But the database also works on the server side and on the desktop. Actually, we have a product called the Realm Studio, which allows you to inspect the database and then modify and play with the schema. That is a desktop app using Realm on desktop. It actually uses React and Electron on desktop with Realm.
You can say in relation to why JVM, so there's actually not that many things tying it to Android, except of actually grabbing the context here and then. So there's no specific bindings to why it should be on Android only. So for testability and also, so just to be able to run it in JVM, it's not that big a step. It's not out there yet, so maybe regretting that, saying that, but there's not that many obstacles just getting there, and with the ability to run all your tests on local JVM instead of having to run it through emulators or real devices, stuff like this.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, so internally we're using JVM targets for our compiler test and for other integration tests in the multi-platform project, but we're not exposing it as a public target we support yet, right?
Okay, so I assume that a lot of the folks listening in on Talking Kotlin are Android developers, just because that's the majority of the people using Kotlin, right? So, as an Android developer, do I also get benefits from this new implementation as compared to the old version that only has like a thin wrapper? I'm thinking integrations with maybe the ecosystem, coroutines. I don't know what else you folks have in store there.
Yeah, so like I mentioned, like the major thing that pushed us to work into the new SDK is to write a Kotlin first SDK and then support the different targets via multi-platform. And so we come up with a design document to see how we could integrate with various frameworks like Flow, Coroutine, RX, etc. So that will be the first benefit for you if you're using already Realm Java. It's like you don't have this previous threading model that people find like constraining in their app. So that's the first thing. The second thing is like we got rid with a lot of layer or tools that we were using to generate this proxy class I talked about, that interface between your model and the C++ database. So we got rid of bytecode manipulation and KAPT to do annotation processing. And because they are super relatively, say, slow in the context of Kotlin for obvious reasons, for people who are using those tools. So we moved to use the compiler plugin in Kotlin. So the definition of the schema will be simpler. You don't have to annotate it with Realm object as we used to do in previously. And the compile time will be relatively fast compared to using an annotation processor. So these are like the immediate benefit, but the long term is architectural benefits. Like you'll be easily interfacing with Flow, Coroutine, or RX Java in your app and be easily passing object between threads.
So let's stay on the whole plugin aspect there a little bit. You know, a lot of people, when they look at frameworks that are heavy in annotations, they kind of say, you know, it's always magic, right? It's too much magic going on because I'm annotating some things and I don't know what's happening under the covers. And now you're saying, well, you don't even need to annotate anymore. This awesome plugin architecture is going to do everything for you. How are the users receiving that? What's the feedback like there?
So far we just released like a couple of months the first alpha. Like people, like the first feedback we had, like it's definitely easy to use, but we didn't gather enough feedback, to be honest, to make a decision to revert back to annotation, which I don't think we want to, just because I feel like annotation has been abused in general in the Java ecosystem. They are just meant to annotate data, but they're heavily used now to becomes the logic in your source file when you stack annotation. But we were doing this because we had a technical limitation in the previous repo where we had to use an annotation processor to do this. Now we're just using a marker interface to say your class person, if you want to persist this, you just inherit from interface Realm object. And that's the only constraint we put on your model to be able to work in the Realm context. So yeah, I think we're heading more into this interface rather than annotating.
All right. So as you said they abused annotations in the Java world. Let's hope we don't start abusing plugins in the Kotlin world, right?
Yeah, that's a good point, because our learning, if we can share it, like for anyone who are planning to write a library on multi-platform, is don't be tempted by doing too much magic with the Kotlin plugin because of two things. First thing is like it's still not documented and stable, so you'll end up doing a lot of refactoring and trying to find out what is working and not. The second thing is like it reduces the readability and debuggability of your code. So if you put too much logic and you generate too much logic into the compiler plugin, your users will not be able to debug clearly what's going on or step into your logic. So what we did is like we reduced the usage of the compiler plugin to only solve the issue of the limitation of Kotlin native APIs versus JVM. So for instance, we don't have full reflection in Kotlin native. So we had to come up with some logic to do like create instance from class literals, which is not available on Kotlin native, but it's available on JVM. The other issue is like how to wire the call from the backing field to the database. That is not possible. You cannot do it something else. But we tried really to reduce it to the minimum and do the rest on the library. So as a user, you can debug it easily, actually.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I asked partially is because we have kind of the same dilemma now in Ktor, right? We're looking at how to change one aspect of it, and instead of having to annotate classes with 2 annotations, maybe just move to a plugin using the plugin. But yeah, anyway.
Meta programming is the hot stuff these days. Yeah. It would seem.
Yeah, like another point about the compiler plugin is like if you just need to generate code, you should consider using KSP from Google or Arrow Meta, because they're good in this kind of scenario use cases. Don't try to do an IR transformation to just put in some logic or generate code. Try to use CodeGen, because you can still debug the generated code versus modifying the IR, which is more risky, less robust, I would say.
So was picking Kotlin Multiplatform kind of the natural choice for you folks, or did you evaluate a bunch of other technologies beforehand and then landed on Kotlin Multiplatform in the end?
I think it was the only choice, to be honest, because we already have like other SDKs doing Xamarin and React Native and Flutter. So for us as Android developer, it was the same thing to do. It seems like a win-win, because we wanted to benefit from rewriting the SDK, but why not doing it as a multi-platform, so you can benefit from supporting as a side effect Java desktop, right? Or we wanted also to see how much we could capture from people doing multi-platform by supporting Cocoa, Apple frameworks.
But we also like Realm being a persistent layer, so we fit well into the Kotlin multi-platform ecosystem of supplying a building block, just like a Ktor for networking and stuff like this. Whereas other multi-platform frameworks targeted it differently from the UI side and down. So it fits nicely, providing this building block for building common intermediate or business layers.
So does new Realm Kotlin SDK expose any kind of API to, let's say, Swift or Objective-C as well, or is it really intended to be used from Kotlin code and then through some abstractions that the developer brings themselves be integrated with the platform?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think we thought about it a little bit and see in which layer we want to position ourselves. And I think the narrative for the developer using Realm Multiplatform is to use it in the shared module to abstract the access to his database. So it doesn't make too much sense to try to expose something specific to Swift or Android, obviously. So the API is designed to be like language agnostic, because we try to also make the transition from people coming from Realm Java to the new Realm Kotlin easier, so they can find the same concept, like how to begin a transaction, how you insert a Realm object into Realm persistent, blah, blah, blah. Or query, for instance. The only particular thing we had to make like a trade-off is like Realm historically tried to be as close to the platform language as possible. What I mean by this is like if you take the .NET SDK, it uses LINQ as a way of querying the database. If you use the Cocoa, it uses NS predicate. If you use Java, it uses like a Fluent Builder API to do query. So the only thing that's going to be relatively a trade-off in this scenario is like the query language we had to pick up. That should feel like natural for people doing Android and Cocoa. And then we end up using like an internal query parser to expose like a text-based query language, which somehow is similar to NS predicate, but slightly different. So that's the only trade-off we had to consider at the time.
So why did you pick NS predicate as kind of the as the base for your implementation? Did you find that was a particularly elegant solution?
It fitted well with the query parser we had on the engine at the time, because historically the engine was built in C++, but the first SDK that was exposed is iPhone and Cocoa, obviously for historical reasons. So that was the history. But for Java, we built on top of it like a Fluent API to do query. But like it's simple enough to pick up. It doesn't have anything Apple specific. It just the syntax is expressive enough that you could use it in like an agnostic way.
So what's on the roadmap for you folks? I mean, where are you taking this next?
So we want, like the first step is like we want to get as much feedback regarding this new architecture and this new Kotlin as possible. We have people like trying this to, for instance, migrating from an existing SQL solution to this. And then the next step is like I mentioned, we want to support JVM as soon as possible, just to allow people to create like desktop apps. So you can see like an added value compared to the previous SDK is also to finalize the implementation of this new architecture of this new concurrency model. So people can see the difference when they integrate this in with their reactive frameworks. So we're working on this as we speak. And there is a Mongo Live conference this summer, and we want to push something like a beta without the sync capability. We're still focusing on the local database.
Okay. So now that people have kind of a bit of an idea about where Realm Kotlin is and it's going, do you have particular things that you would like the community to provide feedback for, maybe, or give their input, or just try things out? Maybe something you want to shout out?
Yeah, so we have the repo. It's Realm-Kotlin on GitHub, so you can try the sample example and give us feedback. We also published we have our design document publicly available, so people can, it's linked on the repo. So you can like see what are we planning to work on, and if you have like feedback, please do comment on it. It's publicly available, and we take a look at it. So we had a lot of feedback, for instance, about moving, people trying to persuade us to move to this frozen object kind of API. So that's cool to see.
Well, then I think folks have a good starting point for if they want to explore Realm Kotlin a bit more. I think we're out of time for today, though. So I'd like to very much say thank you for coming on the show, you two.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Yep. Thank you for coming.
All right. See you around. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye.
Well, if you are still listening or watching, that means that this episode hopefully hasn't been half bad. So remember to like, subscribe, and what should they not forget? That's right.
It's not working.
Oh my God.
Oh, my kid broke my bell.
Well, to fix Hadi's bell, make sure to fix Hadi's bell, make sure to hit the bell next to our subscribe button, I guess. Yeah,
Until
make sure you don't
time.
miss the next one, and see you around. Take care.
Bye-bye.